Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. The channel that guarantees you that you are listening to a human voice and not an AI'd one. So, if you're new here, help me grow my channel by subscribing down below. It's free. And if you can, leave a like and comment down below at what time and where you're listening to this video at. Now, without further ado, let's get into tonight's story. It started on my 8th birthday. That's when Mum began to be afraid of the dark. After my party, we cleaned up together. I was still a kid, but I'd started to realise just how hard life had been for her. I didn't know the details. I barely even knew the broad overview of the story, but I knew she'd been through a lot. I pitched in where I could, doing little things like cleaning up to try and make life a bit easier for her. We were almost done cleaning when it happened for the first time. She walked into my bedroom to put some of the gifts in there. The lights were off. I still remember her shriek. It remains nestled deep within my mind, permanently hidden in some forgotten crevice. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap, desperate and pleading. I was in the kitchen, putting away the dishes and getting ready to take out the trash. It pierced through the whole of my being and left me firmly planted there. A part of me wanted to run to help her. She was my mum, and I cared about her more than anything else. But most of me was too afraid to do anything. My mum was the strongest, bravest person I knew. If something scared her, I wasn't sure. I wanted to find out what it was. For about a minute, I was standing right where I was. Her shrieks kept revibrating in my ears, the only sound I could hear. I'm unsure if my brain was just repeating that initial cry out of shock, or if she kept screaming over there, but it was all I could hear. Eventually, I snapped out of my shock and ran towards her voice. I paused. The door to my room was slightly ajar, and her silhouette was just barely visible in the dim lighting of the hallway. I slowly opened the door, grabbed my mum's hand, and yanked her out. I didn't look inside. I'm not sure if that was a conscious decision or just an oversight in the rush. At the start, I was leading her, but within moments, she was in front of me, sprinting and almost dragging me along. Her screaming had stopped at some point. We ran out of the front door and sat outside by a street light. I looked down at my wrist, bruises dotted across it from how hard she'd gripped onto me. She called the police, frantically explaining that someone had broken into our house. I was too young to understand how frightening that thought was, too naive to fully grasp her fear. The night blurred together after that, the mixture of my drowsiness and shock, resulting in a deep confusion as to what was happening around me. I was surrounded by the red and white lights of police vehicles. They took statements from my mum and me, and after sweeping the house, they let us back inside. My mum was terrified of returning, but she put on a brave face for me. Even back then, I could tell that she wasn't really smiling, that she didn't mean it when she said everything was okay. My mum didn't let me leave her side after that. She took me to her room and insisted I sleep there. We shared her bed that night, though it was a bit cramped. That was the first night she kept the lights on when we slept. She moved my bed into her room the next day, telling me I was to stay with her from now on. I moved to turn off the lights before going to sleep, and she screamed at me to leave it on. She said that she needed the lights to be on. I jokingly asked her if she was afraid of the dark. She replied with a serious tone and said that she was. She told me that I should be too. I complained about the sleeping arrangement every night, but my mum didn't budge. She didn't allow me to sleep in a different room and never allowed me to turn off the lights. Every night I would ask her why the lights had to stay on. I whined about how hard it was to fall asleep when the room was so bright. After a few weeks, she finally responded. She told me that the darkness was a world of its own. It hosted monsters, creatures that wanted nothing more than to drag me into it. The light would lock them away and kept me safe. I should always keep the lights on, she said. It was the only thing that would protect me. Her warning scared me to my core. Sleeping was near impossible for me after that day. Every night I'd lay down in bed and picture the monsters kept at bay so close to my bed. Hideous shapes with horns and hooves, gnarled teeth and long claws, 2 heads and uncountable arms, grotesquely tall and inhumanely large. They absorbed the full size of whatever shadows I encountered. A child's imagining of what evil looked like. I knew little of what real monsters looked like. My imagination kept growing as I grew up, with that fear festering inside me. Sometimes I'd see a face come out of the shadow's edge, or a figure take form within them, clothes in my chest, a chair at a strange angle, a tree outside our window. Anything and everything morphed into a nightmarish shape when it came in contact with my terror. When I turned 10, my mother made me go back into my room to sleep. Friends and relatives had commented on how strange our sleeping arrangements were and advised her I needed my own space if I was to develop into a functional, independent adult. She told me I would have my own room, but I had to keep the lights on at all times. She didn't have to remind me. Her singular warning from a few years ago had traumatized me in a way that I'd never forget. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing fear in your parents. These were the strongest people in your young life, the ones you would go for help when you are too scared or uncertain. When they give you a warning that grave with terror in their eyes and desperation in their voice, it etches itself permanently into your memory. It took me a while to get used to the setup. The first night I didn't sleep at all. I was too afraid. I felt like my light grew dimmer as the night went on, that the shadows in the corners of my room were growing stronger and larger. The second night started off as a repeat of the first. I couldn't sleep and found myself scanning the room with paranoia. At one point, I saw my closet door open, a pale hand wrapped around its door frame. I tried to be brave, to convince myself monsters weren't real. Then, I saw the man step out from behind the door, draped in shadows, and embodying my every fear in his eyes. I screamed louder than I have ever had, my pubescent voice cracking as I forced out every last molecule of air from my lungs. My mother was in my room in an instant, not even bothering to check around the room or speak to me. She dragged me out of the bed and rushed me outside. We were at the same street lamp outside our home as we were 2 years ago. The same bruises had bloomed on my wrists, like old scars resurfacing. She called the police. and they went into our home yet again. They told us they found nothing and that we should return now. My uncle visited the next day after my mum insisted. He pulled me aside and sat me down. He told me that my dad had hurt my mum in some really bad ways. The man had left a mark on her that still haunts her to this day. She sees him in places he couldn't be. She was scared of him and projected him onto everything. She was seeing Dad in the shadows when there was nothing there. My uncle told me I was the man of the house now, and I had to keep my mum safe from whatever she was imagining. He said I'd have to show her that there was nothing to be afraid of. I had to be strong for her. I nodded and told him I would, lying with enough confidence to convince myself. I wanted to be strong, of course I did, but how could I? I was scared too. I saw something the night prior, and it terrified me. It didn't matter if no one else saw it. I did. My uncle and a few cousins stayed over that night. Some of them slept in the living room, and others in my room. For the first time in many, many months, I felt safe as I slept. With so many people around me, I knew nothing could get to me. My mum's shriek pierced through my peaceful sleep and abruptly woke me. I heard countless footsteps move as my cousins and uncle ran into her room. Once the sounds of running had died down, there was silence for a bit, and then yelling, indecipherable but clearly argumentative. After a few minutes of my uncle and mum screaming at each other, silence finally returned. My uncle visited my room to speak to me again. He said that my mum claimed to see my dad in the closet. When we went into her room and searched inside, there was nothing but an old coat. She was just seeing things in the dark. She was hysterical, my uncle said. She was losing it, and she was too stubborn to get real help. He told me that I'd have to take care of her, to show her that there was nothing to be afraid of. They all left the next morning, leaving me to take care of my mum. She would wake me with her screams maybe once a month, and I'd go over to her room to nervously investigate. There was never anything there. Some days it was a coat, other days a pair of boots or a chair, but it was never what she claimed to see. Every false alarm helped reinforce the idea that it had all been in our heads. It took me a while, but I slowly grew past my fear. I still kept the lights on, but it felt more like a habit than a fear response. I had finally begun to sleep soundly. Eventually, I convinced her to see a psychiatrist. She was making real progress there. I was proud of her. She was moving past some really deep-seated trauma and working through the horrific damage my dad had caused her. She apologized to me frequently for scaring me like that as a kid. I always told her it was okay, that I didn't hold anything against her, and that I loved her. It was almost my 17th birthday when we began to grow comfortable with the dark again. It had been over a year since her last episode. She was smiling again. We would stay up some nights and watch movies together. I'd still see her eyeing the dark corners and occasionally sleep with the lights on. But it was never anything beyond that. Nothing I deemed alarming, at least until the morning of my birthday. I got out of bed at noon and was lazing around in the living room when I realised I hadn't seen my mum yet. I walked into her to see what she was up to. It was chaos, pure entropy. It was unholy, unlike her to leave the room this messy. It made no sense. Everything was out of place. It looked like there had been an earthquake or something. That's when I realised something critically important. She wasn't here. I scoured every last inch of the apartment before calling her. She didn't pick up once. I called everyone I could. Friends, family, neighbours, co-workers. No one had any idea where she could be. I called the police, and I filed a missing persons report. They came by and searched our house and took notes. I always expected her to return at some point. She never did. Everyone told me she had run away. Even her psychiatrist told me she likely had a strong episode and decided to leave as a fear response. I guess I believed them. My uncle became my legal guardian, though he didn't really involve himself much. What I inherited from my mother was enough to finance me, and he didn't mind me staying at my old home. He was nice enough about everything, and often asked me to live with him, but he understood that I couldn't just leave this place behind. Leaving here would feel like I was cutting all ties with my mother. It would be like admitting she was gone, accepting that she wouldn't come back. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I think that's why I stayed even when the darkness started to ripple and flow. It became fluid, a liquid black that flooded the home every night. Living alone had reignited my fear. I was leaving all the lights on out of fear again. I felt like a caveman, huddling around a fire to keep mythical beasts at bay. It got bad one night. I saw monsters in the shadows again. I was too old to be seeing this. Mere months away from graduating high school, I was ashamed of myself, reduced to little more than that 8-year-old boy who had to sleep next to his mother. I awoke in the middle of the night and was certain I saw a figure at the foot of my bed. I did my best to hold in my scream, to conquer my fear. It might have come out as a choked gag or choppy gasps, but it didn't come out as a scream. It felt as if the figure vanished at my awareness of it, the noise frightening it back into the void it came from. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned my room. There was nothing. Of course there was nothing, but I was still scared. Though it's embarrassing to admit, I walked over to my mother's room that night. I hadn't been in there much since she'd left. It was a painful reminder, but I hadn't gotten rid of her stuff either. It was in the same state the police crew had left it in, a confusing mess, much like my own emotions about her disappearance. I laid down on the left side of the bed, the half that I'd slept on about a decade ago. She always insisted that she needed to sleep on the right side, that it was her half. I slept peacefully that night, dreaming of her, of our family. When I woke up, my back ached. I thought I must have slept wrong, or turned weird or something. As I slowly got out of the bed, I realised what it was. There was a lump in the mattress. A lump right under the very spot I was sleeping under. I pulled back the sheets and uncovered a deep cut made into the mattress with a wooden box stuffed into it. I pulled out the box and opened it. It only contained 2 things, a journal and a gag. What the hell? I opened the journal and was immediately horrified. Every entry was an account of an episode, the fears and visions and self-assurance. She never stopped seeing him. The episodes continued. She just forced herself to be quiet. She gagged herself to keep the screams at bay. She was worried that she might be considered insane, that she might lose custody of me. She'd tortured herself to keep me from worrying, to keep everyone from worrying. She kept it all to herself, and then she just vanished. I cried for hours that day. It was a mix of guilt and loneliness and shame and fear. The fear that came to the tail end of it all when I stumbled across an early entry. I found her describing her version in detail. She must have stopped doing it later to help avoid the visions. She described what she saw as crooked exaggerations of my father, a man I had never seen. She described his tall figure and skinny frame. She talked of angry eyes and a permanent scowl. She feared his silent rage, the scars it had left her, and some of the new ones that the visions did. Some nights her hallucinations grew stronger. There were nights where he would strike her through the shadows. Her mind went so far as to even imagine the bruises and pain the next morning. I felt my gut wrench at the revelation. I knew those bruises. I saw them on her too. She told me they were the result of vitamin deficiencies and blood conditions and whatnots. I'd believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mum after all. But why would she lie to me? Why did she go on thinking that she was hallucinating them if I saw them too? Did she think she was imagining me asking? That she'd imagined me caring? I spent hours in that bed, confused and afraid, attempting to piece it all together. I didn't even notice that night had already fallen. I hadn't left the bed all day. I put the box on the nightstand and decided to lie down, rolling over to her half of the bed. I didn't even have the mental energy to worry about the darkness. I was too caught up with concern of my mother, too racked with guilt for even fear to take root. But fear finds a way. I woke up in the middle of the night, cold and sudden, afraid. My hair stood up, and goosebumps spread like wildfire across my skin. Void rippled and broken, and I saw him slither out of it, tall and lanky and cloaked in shadow. I saw him walk across the edge of the room where the black was strongest. I saw him take his first step out of it, his first step towards me. He stopped right there, just a stride closer to me. His eyes looked at me, studied me, before he stepped back into the dark and left. I was nothing more than a child again, longing for my mother's guiding hand. I read her journal, desperately scouring for any advice she may have left me. But it seems she didn't know much more than I did. The only shield she had ever used was the light, a single lamp being her only defense against whatever that creature was. I was unsure if this would work, but it seemed I had no other option. I left all the lights on that night, and it seemed to have done the trick. He didn't show himself. I thought I was safe. I convinced myself that the light was enough. The lie was reinforced by my continued success. He didn't return for the first few days. I found myself wondering if maybe I had just hallucinated it too. If my mum's paranoia and the trauma of her absence had blossomed into this delirium. There was no such thing as monsters and ghosts. I was just being childish. But he returned a month later, walking through the light like it was nothing. The lamp flickered with each step, and the shadows grew longer. He had come a few steps closer to my bed before retreating back into the black. I knew then that Mum had lied. The light had never been enough to protect us. It had just helped her feel safe. I was afraid again. The fear had returned to me, and it was greater than ever. I couldn't bring myself to brave another night in that accursed place. So I hit the road. I went to a new hotel every night, endlessly on the move, too cowardly to ever stay in one place. He would never know where I was sleeping, so how could he ever find me? I was so sure it would work. Maybe it was just my desperation that fueled that confidence, but it did work for a while, almost a full year. However, I guess that initial doubt never left me. My fears of him remained, maybe even grew as he kept his distance. He visited me in my dreams last week, with the faintest smile on his lips. I saw him for the first time the next night, little more than a tiny shadow in the very edges of my room. He's been getting closer ever since, getting stronger every night. Moving didn't make a difference anymore. I think he caught on to that trick. I went as far as I could. I even took a flight. I tried praying and pleading, confession and ritual. I turned to every deity and faith, despite for any way at all to keep him away. None of it mattered. Tonight, he actually made it to my bed. He's laying down on the other side. I can feel his weight on the mattress now. It's all just a hallucination, right? My mind playing tricks on me. He's not real. He can't be. Please, don't be real.